In 1932, the United States was deep in the grips of the Great Depression. Millions of Americans were unemployed, factories closed, bread lines stretched for blocks. Families struggled to survive on pennies a day. Among these desperate Americans were the veterans of World War I. Men who had fought for their country only a decade earlier now faced hunger, eviction, and hopelessness. They had returned home after the war expecting a government that would honor its promises, but now that promise seemed distant and forgotten. The economic devastation hit them hard. Pensions and support they were supposed to receive were delayed, leaving many veterans unable to provide for their families. Children went hungry. Elderly parents went without medicine. Desperation settled like a heavy fog over their lives. The veterans were ordinary men, farmers, laborers, factory workers, and tradesmen who had served their country during the First World War. They had left their families behind, fought in foreign lands, and survived battles that many never spoke of. Now, in peacetime, they faced an enemy far different from the battlefield: economic ruin and governmental indifference. Their demands were simple. The government owed them early payment for the service bonuses promised years earlier, a promise made to honor their sacrifices, a promise that so far had been broken. Among them were men in their 30s and 40s, many physically weakened from war injuries. Yet despite the hardship, they organized, planned, and gathered in Washington, D.C., believing their peaceful protest could bring attention to their plight. Thousands of veterans began converging on the nation's capital. Some traveled by foot, others by train or hitching rides in whatever vehicle they could find. Families accompanied them, wives carrying children, men carrying bundles of clothing, blankets, and makeshift signs. The journey itself was grueling. The roads were crowded, the trains packed, and the weight of hunger and exhaustion pressed down on every step. Yet hope persisted. Hope that the government would see their suffering and act. Hope that years of service and sacrifice would finally be acknowledged. By mid-1932, the veterans had established camps near government buildings in Washington, D.C. They built makeshift shelters, tents patched with old cloth, fire pits for warmth, and communal areas where families could gather. The smell of wood smoke mingled with the streets of the capital. Children played amidst the tents, their laughter a fragile reminder of innocence, while their fathers and grandfathers organized petitions and met to plan meetings with officials. The veterans were disciplined. They cleaned their camps. They followed basic rules to ensure order. Despite hunger and fatigue, they maintained dignity. Weeks passed. The veterans sent letters. Delegations requested meetings. They submitted petitions. They marched in orderly lines to government offices. But nothing changed. The payments they had been promised did not arrive. Silence greeted them at every turn. This silence was heavier than any winter frost. It was a message: we do not care. As days turned into weeks, frustration grew. Veterans debated among themselves whether to escalate the protest, but they feared violence. Many remembered the discipline of the military, the lessons of war, and wanted to remain peaceful. Meanwhile, the press began to cover the camps, painting a mixed picture. Some reporters sympathized, showing the human side of the crisis. Others focused on the disorderly gathering, framing veterans as a problem rather than victims. Public opinion was divided. Citizens in other states sent aid, food, blankets, and letters of support, but the federal government remained immovable. By late July 1932, the president and his advisors faced a difficult choice. The veterans were still camped in Washington, D.C., their numbers swelling. Reports from the city indicated growing unrest, and local officials feared riots. The tension was palpable. Veterans sat around fires at night, whispering stories of the past, wondering if their sacrifices had been forgotten forever. At the same time, inside the White House, a decision was being prepared, one that would change the course of these men's lives and leave a permanent mark on the nation. By late July 1932, after weeks of waiting and mounting pressure, the president and his advisors reached a decision. The growing veteran camps in Washington, D.C. were being viewed as a threat to public order. Reports from city officials warned of potential clashes if the veterans continued to gather. Inside the White House, the decision was solemn but firm. The U.S. Army would be ordered to remove the veterans from the Capitol. For the veterans, the news had not yet arrived. They continued to hope that reason and justice would prevail. On a hot summer morning, Army units began moving toward the veterans' camps. Soldiers in uniform marched in disciplined formations, rifles at their sides. Tanks and vehicles accompanied them. The veterans were shocked when they saw the troops approaching. Some tried to negotiate, others stood silently, unable to comprehend that their own government would take such measures against men who had fought for the country. The children clung to their parents. Families huddled together, watching as a force they had once trusted now approached with authority and firepower. Initial warning. Soldiers ordered the veterans to disperse immediately. Refusal. Veterans tried to explain their situation, but the military gave no leniency. Enforcement. Soldiers moved in to dismantle tents. Conflict. Minor scuffles broke out. Veterans resisting being pushed out, soldiers restraining them. Destruction of camps. Fires were set, either deliberately to remove shelter or accidentally during the scuffles. Belongings were destroyed. Displacement. Families fled the area. Some were injured, others went hungry and homeless. At every step, the veterans' discipline and dignity contrasted with the harshness of military enforcement. By the end of the day, the camps were empty. The streets of Washington, D.C. were quiet again, but the silence was heavy with loss. Veterans had been removed, their families scattered. Makeshift tents were reduced to ashes. Scattered blankets and charred papers littered the ground. For many veterans, the humiliation and heartbreak were worse than the physical displacement. News of the forced removal spread quickly. Some newspapers supported the government's action, calling it necessary for public order. Others criticized the brutality and betrayal, emphasizing the sacrifice of the veterans and the injustice they faced. Letters poured into editors' offices. Citizens wrote in outrage, condemning the government for punishing men who had already given so much. Despite public criticism, the government largely defended its decision, emphasizing law and order over compassion. The veterans who had been displaced struggled to rebuild their lives. Many returned home without jobs, without homes, and without the promised payments they had fought for. Public trust in the government suffered a lasting blow. For some, faith in the nation's leaders was permanently shaken. The 1932 Veterans Protest became a symbol of government neglect, later studied in history books as a cautionary tale of leadership, accountability, and public responsibility. Though some reforms were eventually introduced for veteran benefits, the emotional and physical scars left by the forced removal could never be undone. The events of 1932 remind us of the fragile balance between authority and empathy. Men who had served their country were treated as problems rather than heroes. Their discipline, patience, and humanity contrasted sharply with the harsh measures taken against them. History may record the facts, but the pain, frustration, and betrayal experienced by these veterans and their families remain deeply human and hauntingly real. Imagine what you would do if you were in their place. Comment your thoughts below, and don't forget to subscribe for more hidden history.